Okay, I'm talking tonight about, as Mike said, about looking back and looking forward. And I spend a huge amount of my time trying to think about the future and what might happen and what we can do about it. And of course, it's a bit of a mug's game, really, because you can never tell what's going to happen. And least of all now, I think George Soros said there's never been a more difficult time to try and predict the future than the current time. But I think one thing you can do is look back and try and learn from the past. And that probably more than anything can help you, if not predict the future, plan for the future. Now, I'm going to go back just over 30 years, 31 years to 1992. So 1992 is when I first started in the sector. And I was working as a volunteer for an organisation called for the Council for National Parks. It's now renamed itself the Campaign for National Parks. And so I was a volunteer here, and I was very lucky. In my first year, I got to go on a trip to the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park, where there was a conference of all the national park authorities and other organisations with an interest in national parks. And here it is in all its beauty. Here it's White Sands Bay, one of my favourite parts of the park. And of course, it was very different then. We all brought our papers, printed rather crudely on non-recycled paper, in our briefcases. We went in our cars, which certainly weren't electric or hybrid. We sent things to each other with faxes. There were no mobile phones. We had no internet or anything like that. So it was a rather different place. But actually what really strikes me is what hasn't changed. So I came to this conference, and as I said, I was new to the sector, and we sat down and we scratched our heads and talked about the need for larger areas for wildlife and the tensions between public access and nature conservation, and what we could do to try and encourage farming to be more environmental, and in short, all the things that we still talk and battle with today. So that was 31 years ago. Now, in some senses, it's a little bit depressing, and you think, well, we've still got these same battles, nothing really has changed. But of course, an enormous amount has changed. And what has changed is the context within which we are doing this work. Now, I came to the Trust in 2011, and this was 3 years after the big financial crash. And at the time, this was labelled as the single biggest financial crash in modern history. Of course, we didn't know at the time there's going to be an even bigger one a few years later when COVID hit, but put that to one side for now. So this would be the biggest financial crash that any of us knew about, certainly since the war. And here you see the demise of Lehman Brothers. Now, that was 2008, and I came in 2011. But of course, there had been a bit of a lag after this big financial crash. And it wasn't really till 2011 that the austerity measures started to kick in. So although it had hit the headlines and people had lost fortunes and all the rest of it, for most of us, the effects of this financial crash really started to hit us in about 2011, at the time the joined the Trust. So a very interesting time to join. But of course, the organisation was a strong organisation at that time. We had these wonderful offices, which we just moved to. I'm sitting in them now. It looks even better than this today, particularly the garden. And this was the envy of all the wildlife trusts in terms of headquarters. Slight worry at the time was that the Trust didn't have any financial reserves. It had used them all to build this wonderful centre, but there we are. Fortunately, nothing bad happened, and we're still around today. But there we are. We had this wonderful centre. The Trust had also built its reputation of being the go-to centre of expertise when it comes to this incredibly important habitat called grassland. The Trust really put this on the map, and still is the biggest champion for this crucial habitat today. And the Trust knew quite a bit about campaigning. So this is, on the left, is a campaign in the late 1990s about rivers. And on the right, you see this rather strange image, one of a series of images. This is a fish mutating and turning into a hedgehog. And of course, our campaign tactics are now very different. But the Trust at that stage was still very keen, very willing to put its neck on the line and be seen and be heard. Now, since I joined, we have had this very, very torrid political period. And on this screen here, you see all the environment secretaries that we've had in the last 11 3/4 years. I'm not going to name them all. I think you'll recognise many of them. They haven't all been complete unmitigated disasters. A few of them have been. But what we do know is that several of them were actively against the environmental agenda. One or two of them one of them in particular talked about the green blob. One of them had said, surely there are more important things than beavers. One of them attempted to sell off as many SSSIs as possible to make money. So we're dealing with some people who really did not put the environment at the top. And this is really the background to much of these last few years. And I think there have been two very different narratives going on in parallel in the political world. And the first one is a rather depressing one. So here on the top left, you see George Osborne with a rather mean expression in his face on this particular day. But the government, the Osborne-Cameron government, of course, their economic policy, whether one agrees with it or not, their economic policy was cutbacks in all sorts of things. So that affected statutory sector, affected things like prosecutions for pollution of rivers, which went drastically down over a number of years. It affected any part of the public sector which had anything to do with the environment. The other side of this, of course, was the deregulation side. So we saw the environment being spoken of as a block to economic growth. And really, in a period of 5 years, I would say we went backwards 30 years in terms of political thinking of the environment. Now, on the right, there's my picture of Nigel Farage. And the point I'm trying to make here is we also saw the rise of nationalism and populism. And it's not just about Nigel Farage and Brexit, whatever your views might be on that, but it's also about Trump and Bolsonaro and all sorts of things happening around the world. Whatever your views on them, it did seem that things were being rather politically turned on their heads. And perhaps the most recent, and I think in some ways the most worrying from an environmental point of view, has been this. It's been the rise of the conspiracy theory. This is just growing and growing. This is a newspaper called The Light. You might have heard some that's been quite on the news quite a bit recently. Its hotbed is, would you believe it, in Totnes. And this is sending around all sorts of misinformation, such as there's no climate crisis, COVID is a hoax, etc., etc. And this is a very, very difficult thing for any of us to control, and it is growing very rapidly. So that's one narrative. But there has been an equally significant counter-narrative, and it's made up of various elements. So here's one of them on the top left, so the growth in activism, groups like Youth Strike for Climate, many, many more people marching and much, much higher awareness among the public, not just in Britain, but across the world about environmental concerns. You've had a sort of resurgence, I should say, because it's not the first time it's happened. We've had a big resurgence in direct action. So in this case, Just Stop Oil, who interrupted the test match. If you're a cricket fan, that was annoying, but it shows just how much impact these groups are having. Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, these are really starting to affect day-to-day activities in Britain. And then another element of this was this real golden age in environmental literature. So books like Rebirding, Silent Earth by Dave Goulson, Guy Shrubsell's recent book on rainforest, George Monbiot's book Feral. These are all bestsellers, all highly rated books. And it's just impossible to keep up with the flood of these books coming through. So you've got these two very interesting counter-narratives that have been going on for the last decade or more. And we at the Devon Wildlife Trust have been trying to navigate our way through all of this. Now, one can spend a lot of time theorizing, thinking about all this big stuff. And what I have to remember is that, yes, it's interesting, but you mustn't fall into the trap of getting drawn down a hole, because you really can't do much to influence it. What you can do, though, is do solid things on the ground. And this is one of the reasons why land acquisition has always really appealed to me, because all this stuff, whether it's a march or a big government announcement, it splashes and bangs, it's gone, it'll change in a minute. It's like the weather when it's coming from the west, as opposed to the northeast. So whereas if you're looking at a reserve like this, it's earthy, it's still, everything moves slowly, you have much more control over it. And it's a lovely grounding, gives you a sense that actually you have some agency, you have some control. So this was the first big land acquisition that happened. So this was started in really my first couple of months at the Trust. And this is Emsworthy. We all know Emsworthy. I've seen lots of slides on it. Beautiful, beautiful, just past its best. The bluebells were a bit early this year, but it's, again, had a fantastic year, albeit a little bit dry. Now, we had already been left by quite a chunk of land at Emsworthy by the wonderful Veronica Laurie, who sadly died 18 months ago, but that was an incredibly generous bequest to, well, actually, it was while she was alive, so it was an incredibly generous gift of hers. But then came the opportunity of actually more than doubling the size of the site. And this is what we were faced with. So this was the land in question. Very, very badly damaged. So here you had lots of intensive grazing by pigs, which were escaping all over the mire, which you can see in the background. Illegal digging of ponds, illegal tipping of rubbish, toxic material, burning. I mean, you name it, it was happening. And this was a very acrimonious acquisition, I have to say, of some people who got into bankruptcy. But thankfully, we got the site, and now the Emsworthy is the beautiful place, including this bit that we know and love. But I show this slide just to remind us what could have been, because this site is not legally protected. It's not a triple SI, and if it had fallen to different hands, it might well continue to look like this, or even worse. Now, around about that same time, I was walking around this site here. This is Ashmore, another lovely reserve up in the northwest. It didn't look like this at the time. This was a rather boring field of cropped grass at the time when I was walking around it in November. And it's since been restored and now looks like this wonderful site it is. But I was walking around the site, and we had got this, we're getting this from DEFRA. It had been bought as a site to dig pits for disposing of carcasses culled from the foot and mouth epidemic, which had happened 10 years earlier. Now, in the event, it was never used as such, which is great. But DEFRA didn't need the land, so they wanted to hand it over to us. And I don't claim any credit for this. This was mainly negotiated before I arrived at the trust. My job was just to close the deal. But I remember standing in the corner of this reserve, and my colleague who I was with, I think it was Simon Berry, pointed in the distance, said, if you look over there across the hedges, you'll see some, rather sinister looking old buildings there. And there's this huge area of quarry. You can't go in, it's all fenced off and you're not allowed to go in. Very dangerous. But there's this huge area of quarry. And I sometimes think it'd be wonderful if Devon Wildlife Trust could get its hands on that, but it's probably much too dangerous and big and expensive. And I shouldn't think it'll ever happen. Well, 2 years later, we got it. And another very, very trying acquisition it was, but it was great. We got it. And this is what it looked like at the time. So an amazing site, yes, but we had these big old buildings, acres of concrete and old redundant buildings full of clay sheds, full of asbestos cement, and lakes looking like this. Who'd want to swim in that? Lots of bare earth. It really was, it was a fantastic site, but it was quite a bleak site. It needed a lot of work, I have to say. And that's what it looks like now. So the lakes are filled up. We were told that would take 4 years, but there was an awful lot of rain there for the next 2 winters, so it filled up in 18 months. And now just look at it. When we bought the site, all this in the foreground was dry, bare clay, and it's now obviously flooded. And these drowned bushes here, as they start to die, it may not look very, very nice, but it's fantastic breeding ground for small fish and bringing life back into those lakes. The most spectacular reserve. And then this was some drone that was a friend of mine, Sam Rose, who flew a drone over this recently and took a film of it. So that in the distance there is that lake, now looking wonderfully clear, reflecting the sky above, no longer milky. And you can just see how this whole landscape has healed spectacularly. And this is now, I would say, the most diverse reserve we have in terms of habitat, different types of habitat, because you've got just pretty much everything here apart from the sea. And yet it was once this industrial scar. And if you look in the middle distance, you'll see those I'm pointing at the screen, that's no good, you can't tell what I'm pointing at. But if you look in the middle distance, you'll see those very manicured looking fields. And that was the kind of habitat this all was before it was dug up for ball clay. So there we are, Meeth Quarry, an absolute game changer. And the third acquisition I want to talk about is very different. This happened a few years later. This wasn't in any way acrimonious. It was a lot of work, took 2 years to happen, but there was a lot of stuff to sort out. And this is 6 separate sites, and it's the Exeter Valley Parks. The Exeter Valley Park weren't in bad condition when we got them at all, but there was an awful lot that could be done to enhance them. And here on the right, you see some of that work. So this is a lovely field. It's taken last year, actually, the shot. This is a lovely field of arable weeds in an area that we re-sowed up on one of the parks, Ludwell Park. And every year, more is done to make these parks more and more exciting for wildlife, which is absolutely fantastic. But what has really excited me about these sites. And what I think has been the real game changer for DWT is that now we have sites which weren't just welcoming a few hundred or a few thousand people a year, but these were sites that got hundreds of thousands of visits every year. And then suddenly we found ourselves in this position where we could get to an order of magnitude more people than we were getting to before. So very important for the sites themselves, but it also formed a real bedrock for our growing work in urban wildlife. And if you think of Devon as a very rural county, but of course you've got three significant sized urban areas in Exeter, Torbay, and particularly Plymouth. And we've done a number of projects here, Exeter Wild City and active neighbourhoods and green mines. And here you see, this is part of the Green Mines project, training the trainers, working with apprentices. I spoke at the conference to mark the end of the Green Mines project just a few weeks ago. And we lay down on our backs and the biggest cinema dome in Europe, looking up at basically what's as half a dish. So it's like the inside of a sphere cut in half. And we were watching films that were completely 360, so half a sphere. And you could turn your head in all directions, and it was literally like you were there in the landscape around you. And these were films that were made by participants in this project. And we listened to environmental poetry, environmental rap performances, all these kind of things. I really felt that this was a generation that were overtaking me and leaving me way behind. And that's exactly as it should be. So exciting to see that development happening. Now, our work in urban areas is important for another reason too, because most of our population live in urban areas. And although there's an enormous proportion or a sizable proportion of people who support the action for the natural environment who live in urban areas, many of them never get out and never get to see those areas. And that's particularly true of a city like Plymouth, where you get some people who never get to see the sea at all. And that's why places like this, the Wetlands Marine Centre, have been really important. Now, the Wetlands Marine Centre has been here for a number of years. It'd been here for quite a few years by the time I came to the Trust. But we had the opportunity recently to renovate it, to upgrade the facilities there. And now we get more than 20,000 people a year coming to the centre. That's had a wonderful year, as you'd imagine, this year so far, not least because of the incredible weather. And there's another very important side to Wembury as well. It's enabled us to encourage people to get active about take action for the natural environment and start banging drums. And this is something Devon Wildlife Trust has always wanted to do. Now here you see quite an old campaign. This is called Petition Fish. So again, this happened, this was started at least anyway before I came to the Trust. And what all the trusts across the country here has got is people to sign their name on a scale and put all the scales on a fish, and then you got as many fish as you could as possible. And the Environment Secretary at the time, who was Hilary Benn, had one of these above his desk in his office in London, which is a great accolade. And the subsequent campaign, which built on this, was a postcard writing campaign, and we got as many of our members as possible to write postcards to their MP to ask for marine conservation zones to be designated, because we'd had a change of government, and the new coalition government was reining back from all this stuff and saying, no, this is not helping the economy, this is not helping grow stuff and create money. We're not interested. So we really needed to up the ante, which is what we did. And of the top 14 marine conservation zones which got the most support from local people, 13, so all but one, were from Devon. Hooray for Devon. Now, I'd like to say that meant that resulted in us getting many more marine conservation zones than any other area. And of course, I'm afraid it didn't. But what it did do is show that actually, if we all work together on this, and we can achieve a fantastic result for the whole country, which we did. I'll come back to this theme a little bit later because there's more to say on marine conservation. Now, campaigns sometimes work and they sometimes don't work, and more often than not, they're somewhere in the middle. And in the case of the marine conservation zones, we certainly scored some wins, but we didn't get everything that we wanted by any means. And we had to learn the lessons from that. And we applied those lessons to the next campaign, which we thought was this one here, over beavers. Now, we talk a lot about beavers, and it's easy to start to believe that actually what happened is that it all started with Devon Wildlife Trust applying for a license to release these beavers into the wild, and we fought a battle and then we won, etc., etc. Of course, that's not quite what happened. The beavers were already out there anyway. We didn't release them, promise, but they were out there anyway, and they've been living there quietly for a number of years. And then they were filmed and they were put on the website. And then the government felt it had to respond because they were in the public, the knowledge was in the public domain. And they said, we're going to round these animals up. They're a public menace. They could make people sick, pass on diseases, and cause all sorts of damage. We're taking them out of the natural environment. And I remember very well that first meeting with the minister and the local MP who I went up with, and they were very sceptical about the whole thing, really talked to us as if we were being pretty irresponsible and not very realistic. So we fought a campaign. We got people locally to take action and to tell the powers that be that they really cared about this animal and they wanted it to stay. And it was easy because there was a wonderful local community on the Otter, and they believed us anyway without us having to tell them. And as a result of that, there was a big turnaround. And I remember a meeting a year later with the same individuals, those same politicians, and they were rubbing their hands and desperately keen to have part of this wonderful PR pie that had emerged as a result of what was going on with the beavers. So that shows really what effective campaigning can do. But of course, the beavers hasn't all been about campaigning and just releasing the animals back in the wild. Important though that has been, so much of it has been about the learning. So part of the learning we've been doing is looking at how the impact they have on the natural environment. So all the different species that can benefit, whether they're bugs or any number of invertebrates or birds or flowering plants or anything else. And we've also looked in particular here at frog spawn. This is rather interesting graph. You'll see how frog spawn started from almost nothing in 2011. And then it went up and up and up till 2017. And then they disappear in 2018. And the reason for that, the clue is in this slide here. We had the beast of the east, which knocked out all the frog spawn that year. But the great news is in 2019, it starts to rise back up again. So this is part of a natural cycle. But again, you see that because of the effect of the beavers, you get that greater resilience. So even if you do get some awful external, I wouldn't say unique one-off event, because nothing is unique or one-off, but a highly unusual event, if you've got the greater resilience in the landscape that beavers provide, then things can recover. They can come back, even if they're knocked out in a particularly bad year. And a lot of the work as well, of course, has been about learning how to manage the beasts, all the stuff that you've heard me and others talk about 100 times before. And particularly on the right here, you'll see the map of some of this mapping we've been looking at areas where beavers might be more easily tolerated and deliver real benefits in the landscape, and areas or catchments where they might be less so. And that mapping work has now been done right the way across the whole of the UK, not Northern Ireland, but the whole of the rest of the United Kingdom. So some really important learning tools we've developed here. And looking to the future, what I'd love to see with beavers is that we don't just see them in a few isolated places or eking out a living in corners of the river catchment where no one really minds them and they're not bothering anyone else. What I would like to see is these kind of river corridors develop all the way along all our rivers in Devon and right the way across mainland Britain. So here what you see is a short section of river where it's been allowed to spread across its natural floodplain. You get this lovely natural habitat, never more than about 100 meters wide. But if you could extend it all the way down to the sea, wouldn't that be a wonderful set of wildlife corridors that could be created by beavers with all the benefits to water quality, flood, wildlife and everything else that goes with it. But nevertheless, I look at this slide and I can't help looking at what's outside this corridor. And it reminds me that 3/4 of Devon is still farmed. Some of it very well, but not all of it by any means particularly sympathetically for wildlife or for soil or for climate or for pollution. And sometimes I've been asked, what's the most effective thing you could do for wildlife in Devon? And I'd love to say, reintroduce the lynx, or create another NEP or something like that. But in truth, I think the single most effective thing we could do would be to take all farmland in Devon and take it from poor, or all of it that's poor, and take it up to average. So what a boring thing to say, but actually I think that's probably the single most effective thing we could do, because just that would lift the general baseline for wildlife so much across the landscape that it would then be much easier for everything else to survive. And because of that, and because Devon is such a predominantly rural farmed landscape, the work we do with farming in Devon has always been incredibly important. And we now have the biggest team of farm advisors of any wildlife trust, to the best of my knowledge. We've got over 20 now, and they provide a real range of services. So we have people you see on the top left here monitoring water quality with expertise in pesticides and all the things that get fed to animals and sprayed on crops, etc. We have experts in grazing management systems, mob grazing and others, rare breeds, etc. We have people who know how to harvest wildflower seed and spread it. We have people who understand the kit that you need to decompact soils and analyze soils and look at the right treatment for soils, natural flood management, and using drones here on the bottom left to do aerial surveys, to look at areas of soil compaction and other issues. So we have this broad range of skills that we can offer farmers, and in almost all cases for free. And this now is showing all the areas that the trust works. So the trust has always been involved, or at least when I came, the trust was involved in farm advice, but we have grown very significantly the areas that we work with farm advice and the type of advice we provide. So it's not full coverage of Devon yet, but hopefully it will be before too long. But this, I think, is perhaps of all the things we do, one of the most significant for wildlife. And here are just some statistics from one of our teams working wetlands, which we shared just a few days ago. I'm not going to read this aloud. You can read, I'm sure, much more quickly than I can speak it. But just draw your attention to the third bullet there. So providing advice on 28,000 hectares, delivering positive management on just over half of that. So 14,761 hectares, or let's say about 15,000, because this is only one of the many projects that we run. Now, to put that in context, the area of Exeter City, the whole of the area of Exeter City, I'm sitting in the middle of it now, is about 5,000 hectares. And that 14,761, or let's say just over 15, that's work delivered over 3 years. So what you're talking about there is an area of new land that is put into positive management for wildlife, the size of Exeter, every single year. Anyway, I think what I was about to say is we then had the woman for the hour, is going to hopefully appear on my screen. Yes, here she is. Brilliant. Right. So at the same time as this, we saw a big change in what was going on in the environmental sector. So this was the woman of the hour, Greta Thunberg, and it was remarkable to see how the environmental sector suddenly seemed to reclaim its mojo. Because to be honest, I think we'd become a little bit defensive. Because we'd had several years of being pushed back, and we were trying to come up with arguments, trying to justify how the environment actually paid its way and it was good for the economy and all these things which are true, but are not things that we should really be having to argue. And I think Greta Thunberg showed us that we didn't need to. And I've shown this slide in more than one presentation before, but I can't resist showing it again because I think it's just such a remarkable picture, because it says so many things to me. And the biggest thing it said to me, this was during COVID, and the biggest thing it said to me was, even COVID will not silence us. Even all the restrictions of lockdown will not stop us of making our point, putting our point across. And this is the silent protest. And various other things started happening at this time too. And one was the big growth in radical concepts like rewilding. Now, rewilding wasn't new. I remember writing a paper on rewilding back in the early 1990s. And of course, NEP had been going for some years by now. But in the latter part of the teens, it really started to take hold of the public imagination. And it wasn't just about bigger areas, it was about bringing things back, and not just bringing back little things, it was bringing back big, dangerous things, which made a mess and pushed over trees and dug up the soil and disrupted. And this was catching on to the sort of the public, disenfranchisement with what was going on politically and elsewhere. So it was perhaps a positive response to that. But anyway, this great resurgence and great sort of rediscovering of its mojo that the environmental sector had around this time about 5 years ago. Very, very exciting. And we at Devon Wildlife Trust attempted to respond to this. And one of the first things we did to respond to this is we launched a campaign on insect declines. This was something we felt wasn't being talked about enough. Insects were declining 8 times as fast and continue to do so, I'm afraid, 8 times as fast as mammals and birds. And we did this as we led this from Devon. We did this initially as the part of the Wildlife Trust in the Southwest. You'll see the report if you look carefully, the first one we launched saying insect declines and why they matter with Professor Dave Goulson, and that was with the Wildlife Trust in the Southwest. The second one we did, reversing the decline of insects on the top, on the left there, was with the whole Wildlife Trust movement. Now, I cannot say honestly whether this changed the world or not. I don't think we'll ever know. But what I think it did do is it galvanized us as a whole movement around something, and it started making us think about getting our own house in order. How much were we using pesticides on our own land? And how carbon neutral were we for that matter? So we started working hard on that. And we put back a policy which we led on elimination of pesticides from our estate. I'm proud to say we were the first trust, to the best of my knowledge, to put up our hands and say we will commit to going carbon neutral by 2030. So a really important moment, I think, for us. A bit of not, I would say navel gazing, but an important bit of looking in the mirror, because the most important thing you can do if you want to influence others is to make sure that you're walking the talk yourself. So a very significant moment. Now, I would love to say in Devon that we responded as well by having our own NEP. And we haven't got our own NEP in Devon, and that may never happen because the landholders in Devon are very different to what they are in say, Southeast England, where NEP is based. But this is one of the projects which I am very excited about. So this is the east side of Dartmoor. It's a landscape recovery area, and we're looking at 5,000 hectares, 12,000 acres, and we're wanting not to rewild it all, but we're wanting to soften the boundaries and restore wildlife right across the landscape. It's going to take 20 years at least. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to do it, and neither am I sure exactly what it's going to look like at the end. And that's partly what makes this exciting. But this is the kind of thing that I hope it will be. Now, this is another slide I show quite often because I love it. So this was a great illustration done by Exeter National Park Authority, for which they unjustifiably got an awful lot of stick. But I think it's a wonderful illustration because what it shows is not land abandonment. It shows what might happen to land if we just just stop strangling it, just stop trying to overwork it all the time, let the hedges grow out, just rein back a little bit on the ploughing, on the levels of grazing, let the verges wild up a bit, and let the rivers expand over their natural course. And this is the kind of thing that I hope we would see in East Dartmoor in 20 years' time, if not sooner. We've also responded by looking at other beasts to bring back into the mix as well. So this is one of the pine marten. Now, this is a slightly harder sell than the beaver, if I'm honest. It's not quite the same because beavers were extinct in the UK. They've been reintroduced in Scotland, but that has a very different legal environment to us. But pine martens aren't extinct in the UK. But nevertheless, they're not found in the wild, certainly legally, in Devon or in the Southwest. So this was about bringing back a species that was already here, but in very small numbers and highly endangered. It's a carnivore. Is another reason why it's slightly controversial, and it's not quite as cute and cuddly as the beaver. Beavers aren't as cute as cuddly as most people think. You really want to give them a bit of a wide berth, but they certainly look like things you could stroke. You wouldn't want to stroke a pine marten particularly, but these are really important subtle predators. They live in low densities. They do take grey squirrels. And they do take birds, but they are very unlikely to spend their time hunting down the last wood warbler. They are much more likely to pick on a pigeon or a corvid, or something like much more common in wooded areas. Now, will reintroducing white pine martens completely turn our woods around or not? We won't know. We won't know until we try. But what we do know is that they are a very important missing piece of the jigsaw, and our woodlands have many missing pieces in their jigsaw, and their ecological health is not good. So reintroducing something that was once, until very recently, part of that ecology can't be a bad thing, at least to try. I'm not quite so far advanced, but certainly something we're looking very seriously at is this beast here, the wildcat. And the main thing we are doing at the moment with this wonderful animal is hopefully dispelling some myths. So first of all, it's not the same species as the domestic cat at all. It's a different species. They do hybridize when there are very few around, very few other wildcats around, but otherwise they don't. They tend to avoid each other. So this is bigger, and it's a different species. It's the UK's rarest mammal, and it will almost certainly become extinct within the next 2 decades if more action is not taken. The population in Scotland is perilous, in real peril. They are not, in contrast to what most people think, animals that happily live in remote highland areas, such as the name the Scottish wildcat might give. If you look at in Europe, they live in lowland areas mainly and in broadleaf woodland. The reason why they're still in Scotland is simply that they've been exterminated everywhere else. The prey is not small birds predominantly. I wouldn't say they're not going to take something that falls out of a nest, but their prey is predominantly small mammals, mice and voles. They will also take rabbits. And they live at very low densities. So if you take your average size farm in Devon, one wildcat will have a range of 3¼ of those farms. And just to give a comparison, there are over 70,000 cats in Birmingham. So Birmingham is the cat capital of the world, something I learned just 2 days ago. Cat capital, no, not of the world, of England, sorry. And domestic cats, I should say as well. So let me rephrase that. Birmingham is the domestic cat capital of England. Got it right that time. So there are over 70,000 cats there. If you took away all those cats and just relied on and just used the same area and worked out how many wildcats you'd have there, you'd have about 150. So that gives you an indication of the low densities they live in. And my guess is that either with the wildcat or the pine marten, if you introduced them, most people wouldn't even know they were there. So, but nevertheless, very exciting. Now, less headline grabbing, but equally effective, perhaps even more so for wildlife, has been the growth in these groups here. So there has been a huge surge in the growth of community groups in the last 5 years. Not entirely down to Greta Thunberg, but it's part of that movement. So lots of local activism, and it's wonderful. And these groups, so you see here, we have a team of 3 at Devon Wildlife Trust, which we started about 2.5 years ago. One of them is here, Hetty, helping this group. And the great thing about these groups is it's not us, the Wildlife Trust, taking our show to them. They come to us with their idea. It might be planting trees. It might be planting wildflower meadow. It might be removing litter and rubbish from a river. It might be changing the consumer habits of their village, or it might be turning everyone in the village to solar. Any number of different things. But the point is, it's the community's idea, and we help them. And I was listening to an interesting talk by George Monbiot the other day, and what George was saying is that societies are like amoebas. They don't move from the middle. They move around the edges. They move around the edges. The middle, which is kind of government and everything, that's all too staid because it's held in place by status quo and vested interests and all these things. But it's the edges where you get the really interesting stuff, and that's where these groups come in. This is one of our most recent projects. So we have just completed the acquisition of this Bowden Pillars, I should say. It's just south of Totnes. And here you can see most of the land in the foreground is part of this beautiful farm. Now you can see straight away it's land that's been worked pretty hard. You would not buy this just because you're interested in the wildlife on it. There's not much wildlife there apart from what lives in those rows of trees. But what it does have is huge potential for restoration. And this is part of a new direction, again, inspired by recent events of actually buying land that's not much good for wildlife, as opposed to trying out the bit, just buying the last few bits that are, buying land that's not much good for wildlife and massively improving it. But what really interests me about this project is that it's bringing a number of different things together. It's not just about wildlife conservation. So we have teamed up with a number of other organisations, the Apricot Centre, and they are very interested in regenerative farming, and Reset, who are very interested in One Planet Living, which is building communities who live as if there is only one, as if there is one planet, as opposed to what most of us do, which is live as opposed to 3 or 4 planets. So it's green build, it's green consumerism, it's making sure that you help out the local community, that you buy at least half your food and products in the local community, etc. So we will be rolling all these 3 things together at Bowden Pillars Farm. The restoration of native forests, that's a bit we're going to be leading on. Apricot Centre on the regenerative farming, Reset on the green build. But having all these in one project, in one place in Devon is very, very exciting. This will long outlive me, but I really wish it well, and I hope it provides a model for all sorts of other similar projects across the UK. Now, it's all very well talking about successes, but I think we should also talk about things which haven't gone quite so well. This is one of them. This is Seat Jurassic. So we spent an awful lot of time on Seat Jurassic a few years ago. You're seeing here in the top picture, this is the day when we opened it to the public. And here is, we can't quite see her, but just behind me is Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, turning up, the first royal visit to Seaton. And all the people who came to see her. And it was a great occasion. We opened the centre. It was very different to anything that we or any other wildlife trusts had done before, to be honest. It was going on quite a different direction. And we ran it for 6 years, and then we decided that we really had to close it down. COVID was the final nail in the coffin, but it just wasn't making commercial sense. So you could look back and say, well, we shouldn't have done it. And I don't agree. I think for an organisation to progress, you have to try new things. You have to accept that you won't always succeed. You have to embrace that failure. So I'll always be proud of Seat Jurassic, even though ultimately it didn't work. And it's not the only thing. We also tried another project called Nature Schools. So this didn't progress quite so far, but we at one point were set to be the first, not just the first trust, but to host the first school, nature school anywhere in the UK. It was going to be near Oakhampton. We had our sister school set up. We had the curriculum all arranged. We had so many things in place. And then there was a change in political direction, and that killed it. But again, it didn't happen. Perhaps it was 2 years of wasted blood, sweat and toil. But actually, I think we learned a huge amount from what we did achieve and what we didn't succeed through that. So I really hope that the Trust continues to be an organisation that tries new things and is not afraid to fail sometimes, as long as we're honest about why we failed and that we learn the lessons from it. And I think that, combined with our culture, is why the Trust has continued to succeed and to grow. And again, I won't go through all these statistics on the right. All I would say is that they're considerably bigger, all of them, than they were 12 years ago. But one other thing I could have put on and should have put on is that we're now in a healthy financial state, which we weren't all these years ago. And that's not just growing. The important thing about that is that we have money that we can invest in things that we think are important. We don't just go around there chasing funding. Have to do that for a lot of things, but there are, one example of them is our community engagement work. We fund that all from within the Trust, or mostly from within the Trust. And if we weren't able to do that, it wouldn't happen. So critically important that we have those funds. Now, looking to the future then, who knows what's going to happen in the future, but I've just got a few hopes and wishes, which I'm going to run through very quickly, nearly done now. So this is one, temperate rainforest. What an amazing habitat. I have no idea in 50 years whether it's going to be climatically possible for this rainforest to survive in Devon. I desperately hope it is, with all its moss and ferns and fungi and lichen and all the other wonders that you find there. And I hope that we can not just protect what we've got, I hope we can double, if not treble, the area that we have, because the remaining fragments we have are absolutely tiny. And wouldn't it be wonderful if every major river valley going into Dartmoor and into Exmoor looked like this? So on the right here, this is the Dart Valley. The woodland on the right is part of our largest nature reserve, the Dart Valley Woods. But wouldn't that be incredible if we had these kind of valleys on the edges of Dartmoor and Exmoor? And while I'm talking Dartmoor, I desperately hope we can solve the wrangling going on the High Moor. So this is a bit of the High Moor. This is near Emsworthy, which we talked about earlier on. And this part of Exmoor this part of the High Moor on Dartmoor is reasonably well managed. But lots of parts of High Moor, even tripler size, are not well managed at all. They are linear deserts, very little there. At the moment, I'm about to walk on one of these sites tomorrow afternoon to have a look at it and see what we can do to try and resolve some of the difficulties. But we have a lot of people shooting at each other, and there's very little progress. All that everyone can agree on is that nobody likes the status quo. So surely it's madness not to try and change the status quo. So desperately hope we can do that. I think that's going to be more about patience and negotiation than any great environmental strategy. My third ask is about marine. So this is a picture of Lundy, Seizure Island Lundy. So Lundy, for ages and ages, till literally a few months ago, was the only properly protected, fully protected marine area around the UK. So a no-take zone or highly protected marine area, HPMA, whichever you want to call it. There are now 3 others, but none of them particularly big. And this one is tiny. It's amazing, the diversity of wildlife there, but it's a tiny, tiny area. I would like to see a third of all our seas around the southwest protected. I'd like to see a big protected area off the south coast of Devon and another big one off the north coast of Devon, at least one. Big areas, not a few paltry square kilometres, big areas, thousands of square kilometres. Now, there are those who will say that this is taking land away or sea away from fishing and extraction and renewable energy and all the rest of it. There is enough sea there if we manage it properly. And just look what's been happening. Over the last 100 years, we have been fishing ourselves down the food chain and out of business. And the reason for that is because there is nowhere for fish to hide. So we need those places for fish to hide, for populations to recover, and we will see the catches, just as they've done in other parts of the world, we will see the catches expand dramatically around the edges of those protected areas, those no-take zones. That's what we need to do here around our seas in Devon. It will pay massive dividends. And we have a lot of special species in Devon. We've got 96 special species out of a much larger number of ones that are rare. And here are some of them on the left. Now, these big projects will do so much, but if we want to protect all these species, we really need to be more forensic. We need a proper strategy. We need to look at where all these are and how we're going to save ones. You know, like the narrow-headed ant, which exists on one site, like Heath lobelia, which exists on 4 sites, or the hedgehog harvestman, which I think is on 2 sites. I mean, we really got to have a careful strategy if we're going to save these species. Now we have an opportunity through the extremely unsexily named local nature recovery strategy. Now, this particular map I've just shown you, that's not from the local nature recovery strategy. That's an older map that was produced some years ago. But it's this same kind of mapping that we need to be doing, looking at where the priority areas are and making sure that funding and policy is directed towards them. Now, the local nature recovery strategy could go the way of biodiversity action plans, local agenda 21, and many other initiatives. It could become a bit limp-wristed, a bit bureaucratic, and not achieve very much apart from paperwork. But it could equally become really imaginative, really far-thinking, locally owned, and absolutely game-changing. And the difference between those 2 scenarios will be due in large part to the amount of effort that organisations like the Devon Wildlife Trust choose to put into it. So let's make sure we do. I would love us to have a flagship nature reserve. Now, what am I complaining about? We've got some wonderful sites. We've got over 60 nature reserves, big ones, small ones, wild ones, ones with lots of different species, ones with a few incredibly rare species in them. But what we don't have is a site like this. This is the Attenborough Centre in Nottinghamshire. Nothing to do with David Attenborough. It's just happens to be near the village that's called Attenborough. So large site, about 450 acres. Fantastic for wildlife, one of the best birding sites that you'll find anywhere in the county. And more to the point, or equally important, I should say, it's got a very high carrying capacity. So hundreds of thousands of people can come here every year and learn and enjoy, watch, get fed, whatever they want to do, buy stuff. And that's bringing all those elements together in one place is what I call a flagship nature reserve. And I think we need at least one of these in Devon. Maybe the right place will be the Exeter Valley Parks, but we'll see. But I do think we need one. And I would love to see that community work, which we started quite recently, grow and grow and grow. We reached over 200 groups. Our team of 3 advised over 200 groups last year. But there are 426 parishes, and some of them are pretty damn big in Devon. So we need to be doubling, trebling, quadrupling that number and increasing the quality of our input as well. So a huge amount of work to be done. And you know, each one of these groups can do something dramatic for wildlife. Any one of these groups is worth five papers or grand policy statements from Westminster. It's here at the local level that the real business gets done. And while we're talking about people, there are groups out there who we just simply don't get to. This is a project that, again, I've shown this slide before, but this is a project that really inspired me. And it is a partnership between the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and another organisation. And what they've done is they've tried to get together lots of people, recent migrants to the area. They don't speak English as their first language. They don't have any links to the local communities. They're really struggling. and this project brings them together. It gives them a sense of purpose. It helps them bond, rebuild their self-confidence, and do a whole load of good for the natural environment at the same time. What an amazing, inspiring project. And of course, what we don't say is perhaps all the environment, all the social ills that might develop if a project like this doesn't happen. So let's do some more things like this in Devon too. How inspiring would that be? And ultimately, anything is possible if you have a great team of people, which we do, backed up by a fantastic team of volunteers and by an incredible membership and group of supporters. If you've got those people behind you, there is nothing that you can't do. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harry. That was absolutely wonderful, and what a great slide to end on. So if you could just stop sharing your screen, I should say, and then we'll open the meeting up to questions. So I'll just spotlight myself and you, hopefully. And then, yeah, so we've got quite a few questions to get through, so I'll try and get through them as quickly as possible. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us. So the first question is, what level of confidence do you have in the Nature Recovery Network policy?
Interesting one. I mean, I would say it's a hard one to call at the moment. The good news is that it's there in law, which it could easily not have been. It could have been something much more limp-wristed, but it's there in law, which means that it has to be delivered. Local authorities have to. You have to have an accountable body, and that has to be a statutory body of some sort. Can't be something like the Devon Wildlife Trust. So these things are going to have to get done. So I think with a fair wind, and in a county like Devon, where you've got a really good environment sector, a strong local nature partnership, and you've got a population who really want to get the stuff done, it could be quite a game changer. But I think, as with all these things, it's going to have to be backed up by legislation and policy change and funding elsewhere, because any number of plans or promises won't deliver very much if the farming policy and the building policy and the transport policy just don't back it up. So that's what we've got to do. It's the start of a process, and we've got to keep pushing for changes elsewhere to make sure that it feeds right through the system and delivers real results.
That sounds very logical. Thank you. And the next question is, when did the Wildlife Trust all get together under the same logo? I'm not sure if you know the answer to this question. I did have a little bit of a Google whilst we were listening to your talk.
Well, yes, well, logos and Wildlife Trust, yeah, God, don't go there. Well, we have actually quite recently, after a long period of time, agreed a new logo, and I think now pretty much all the trusts are using it. So it's the logo that you can see. Can you see one anywhere? I think it's the one that appears on the slide.
On my lanyard, which is hidden by.
There we are. That's right. So it's a slightly rounded badger as opposed to the square one, the sort of speech bubble badger. And then you have Devon Wildlife Trust, Somerset Wildlife Trust, Cornwall Wildlife Trust, etc., etc. So most trusts have now moved to that. There are a few exceptions. Scottish Wildlife Trust still has its own logo, but Scottish Wildlife Trust has always had a slightly separate relationship to the rest of the movement because of the devolved situation there. But we're in a much better and more unified place on logos than we were 2 or 3 years ago, I can tell you.
Yeah. And just to add to that, in terms of when we all originally kind of joined together as the Wildlife Trust, I suppose, as a movement, I gather that's in the 1950s, when a lot of the kind of smaller community volunteer-led groups were being formed. And apparently by the end of the 1950s, the Society and the Rothschild formed, took the role of the National Association to represent the trust. So if anyone was thinking, when did the kind of trust name, I suppose, unify, that was probably in the 1950s.
Yeah, well, we were called the Devon Trust for Nature Conservation, which most of them were the county, whatever it is, Trust for Nature Conservation. Then we changed our name, I think it was in the 1980s, to the Devon Wildlife Trust, and then we used to have this national body called the RSNC, or the Royal Society for Nature Conservation, which became the Royal Society for Wildlife Trusts in early 2000s, late 1990s. Anyway, we collectively referred to ourselves as the Wildlife Trust for 20 years or more. But yes, still got a few bits of work around the corner, around the edges there.
Excellent. And so the next question is, did you imagine when you joined that DWT might make the impact that it's done in 12 years?
That's a really interesting question. I think I hoped that we would have a big impact. Exactly what form the impact would take, I didn't know at the time, because everything was so hard to predict. When I first joined, everyone was talking about cutbacks. We were talking about less income all the time. We were fighting to hold on to what we've got. So although we had opportunities out there were coming left, right, and centre, we were fighting. It was like we were trying desperately to hold back the tide. And it took a few years before we went into sort of growth mode. So our membership has grown, but our membership actually lost ground for my first 3 or 4 years at the trust, and then it grew quite rapidly for a while, and it's just shrunk back a little bit in the last year because I think recession, other things. But I think there's a general upward trend. But it was very, very hard to know what was going to happen, and it was such a strange time in that first coalition government when suddenly it was like you were back in the early 1980s. And it was like, no, you've got to sweep all this stuff aside. It gets in the way of economic growth. And the idea of, our triple SIs being put up for sale, for drilling and mining and stuff. I mean, none of us could quite believe it was happening. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, but that was the political discourse at the time. So I didn't know what we know. At one point, I thought, well, if we can just hold on to what we've got, maybe that'll be success. Unfortunately, it hasn't turned out that way, but it has been an extraordinary period politically and economically. Hard to predict anything.
And if I like to just add to that, I think it's, and you've mentioned it, I think we wouldn't be here without our volunteers, our supporters, our members, those who kind of leave legacies and donations. And I think that's what's kept us going throughout all of this. And obviously our wonderful team that fundraises for us as well. So the next question is, how can we work to cultivate influential friends in high places, i.e. government, to ensure our messages get across regarding wildlife and the environment?
Yeah, there are a lot of things you have to do. I mean, a lot of it is just good old-fashioned networking and making the effort to be seen in places. So, you can't spend all your time in conferences and schmoozing, and I actually try to spend rather little of my time doing that, but you do have to spend a bit of your time doing that. We had a roundtable meeting of MPs back in January. We've got another one in 2 weeks' time, 2 days before I leave the trust, actually. So you have to do quite a bit of that work. It's really important, of course, to be seen to be an organisation that delivers and means business. So people take us a lot more seriously. When we started with the beavers, as implying the talk, the politicians didn't take us particularly seriously. And when they saw that actually we could deliver and bring all this partnership together, then they take us an awful lot more seriously now. So being good at delivering stuff is effective too, and having a big supporter base. So, when people talk about, what's the role of a member, what's the role of a supporter? Well, all sorts of things. But I can tell you, when you're trying to influence people, if you can say, well, I've got 37,000 members, 70,000 supporters behind me, then they open their eyes, because they know they're not just people, they're not just customers who come to you because maybe all the cheap, go to the local shop because it's convenient or it sells the food more cheaply. They're there because they want to be there. They're there because they support your cause and they will make a noise for you. And so it's so important to have that supporter base as well. So I think all those things, and being tenacious, just keep bashing away at it, and showing that you won't give up until you get what you want.
Very nice message to end on. So the next question is, you've often talked about kind of locally owned. Do you believe that for wildlife recovery to really happen, that it will only do so if there is a sense of local ownership in someone's space?
Well, I think local ownership is incredibly important. I mean, it's not to say that you can't get projects like, say, NEP and others, which could do incredible things for wildlife on an estate. And there are others. There's a big estate up in Hokum in Norfolk, which is looking at putting 25,000 acres over to wildlife, and some extraordinary stuff going on, and it's really, really inspiring. But ultimately, I think it's more effective in the greater scheme of things if they're community-owned projects, because you then get you get the community not just policing it and making it happen, but also you've got the community thinking, well, how do we need to change our lifestyles to make this happen more elsewhere? And that's, I think, how ideas spread, and how lifestyle changes spread as well. If it's all shut up in private estates, I'm not saying we shouldn't have that, because some wildlife probably does need to exist in large areas where there's control. But that in itself, on its own, I don't think it's going to solve it. I think having lots of individual communities around Devon all doing things for wildlife, that little and everywhere, is just critically important, because most of our species, if you think about them, they're not going to live in one place. They hop around, and they need networks of wildlife. They travel around from place to place. And the idea of the nature recovery network is not that you have a big block here and then a big gap and a big block somewhere else, that you have all these little, it's like these little roads or wiring or whatever analogy you want to pick. It's those routes that wildlife needs to travel along if it's going to survive.
Very well put. And yeah, I think our wider communities team, which you touched on, are doing a fantastic job of helping those communities take that action in their areas. So we're just going to have one last question. I think it's a nice one to end on. So in your time at DWT, what have you been most proud of?
I mean, most proud of the team, if I'm honest. I know that's a bit of a cheesy thing to say, and it sounds like I'm being all creepy, but actually it's true. And the reason I say it is because I've worked in various organisations where you don't have a cohesive team, and you don't feel you have a board of trustees that really want you to succeed, and people are watching your back all the time, or you're watching your back against other people, and you don't, you might hold on to your power base, but you're never going to achieve very much. But Devon Wildlife Trust is the best place where I've ever worked, and felt we're all pushing in the same direction. It's not that we don't occasionally have disagreements and difficulties, but I felt the trustees want to succeed, the staff will want to succeed, the membership, volunteers, the supporters, we all want to succeed. We all support each other and push in that direction. And that's what really, really gets things done. So it's the team. And if I was going to pick one other thing, I would say Devon. If you can't do this in Devon, where can you do it?
That's absolutely wonderful, and I think I'd like to say, probably on behalf of everyone, both in this talk and in the organisation, that you've been an absolute brilliant kind of head of the team, and kind of steering the ship. And obviously, as you've highlighted, it's been a wonderful journey and achieved a lot. So I think that's where we're going to end this evening. Thank you, Harry, for staying with us, for powering through in 12 years in one presentation in 1 hour, which is not an easy feat. And thank you to everyone who's offered questions, offered comments about their local wildlife. It's absolutely been wonderful. And yeah, catch up with our later events throughout the summer, throughout the year. And thank you for your time and your support. And good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.